Joe Burrow's contract. So obviously it's been incoming since, it became clear that Joe Burrow was going to be one of those guys, one of those elite quarterbacks in the NFL. And now we're hearing talk that Burrow is, the quote was, keeping teammates in mind. His exact quote, I forget where I stole this from, SI maybe. Whenever you have guys on the team that need to be paid, that's always on your mind, Burrow said. You want that to be a focal point. We're working to make that happen. So they've obviously got Burrow coming up. They've got T. Higgins coming up, Jamar Chase a little later in the process. But the Bengals are looking at this, trying to figure out how, if at all, they're going to keep this nucleus of the key components of the passing game together. What's your take on this whole Joe Burrow contract deal?
I will say, obviously Jamar Chase and T. Higgins are his buddies. I think every time they say something to that effect at the microphone, Joe Burrow's agency yells an expletive in their offices. But nevertheless, look, I think you can, with the way you structure a contract from a cash standpoint, you can make things more amenable for your club to keep players around. But I would say, look, when teams talk about cap and how they need guys to take – the cap is not really that big of a constraint. It's more the cash flows and how they're paid out, which we'll get into that a little bit. So, look, I do think he's maybe going to be willing to do something creative with how he's paid, but it's also going to take Cincinnati being creative and, frankly, departing from a lot of their precedents, because the way you can counterbalance low cash flows in early years, like Patrick Mahomes, is you guarantee money further out into the future than any other contract we've ever seen, and that's something Cincinnati has never done.
So, starting from sort of step one, do you think that it's even possible? Let's start with that, for a quarterback to specifically make it easier for teams to sign other players by leaving money on the table, not necessarily from a structure point of view, but actively taking less money to ensure that there is money available for, his receivers or his offensive line or whatever it is that they believe is important to help build a franchise. Because there's an article out there by Andrew Brandt, who used to run the Green Bay Packers salary cap, and he effectively argues that it's kind of a myth, this idea of taking less to help a team out. And his sort of main point throughout this article is essentially it's not about the cap, it's about cash flow. It's about how much money is coming out, not about what the salary cap is effectively just the accounting tool and where it's moved around. But a quarterback taking less money is not really a thing that happens.
Yeah, all respect in the world to Andrew Brandt. He does phenomenal work. I think he kind of contradicts himself in that very article. So look, from a cap standpoint, I completely agree. It is an accounting tool. You can manipulate it to an extreme degree. Whenever an owner says the cap is constraining their ability to do things, you can point to other teams that obviously go about business a different way and prorate a bunch of money. And yeah, you don't always want to be, the Saints, but you certainly can be 70%, 80% of the Saints and still get away with it. But the cash thing, he says, he's like, oh, you don't have to take less money, and you don't. Obviously, owners, most of them are rich enough to do whatever they want and spend a ton of money. But then he also does say in that article, if you take less cash, the only person you're benefiting is the owner. Again, agreed. If the owner views that then as, okay, I'm being benefited by this player taking less, and instead of pocketing that money, I'm now willing to go spend that money on other positions, right. Again, just cash, then in effect you are helping. So I think that's the disconnect. And I'll give you the example. And it was during COVID, so it was a little bit different, and obviously it was an unprecedented contract. But Patrick Mahomes, through the first 2 new years of his contract, is going to make less money than Lamar Jackson will make in the first year of his new contract. And again, I'm not saying either guy should be forced to do whatever. Lamar has every right to get the structure he wanted, to get strong early year cash flows. But Patrick Mahomes, because of the guarantee protections, took less cash. And I think it's why Chris Jones was on the franchise tag, got extended. It's why Travis Kelce got a new deal, and so on and so forth. I guess you could counter, well, then why didn't they keep Tyreek Hill? It's a fair counter to that whole, thought process there.
Yeah, but I mean, it doesn't mean it's gonna extend to every player that's on significant money. Like as soon as you have a quarterback on that big money deal, and we'll get to this later on, you're going to have to make sacrifices somewhere, but that doesn't mean that the guy isn't still helping you with the structure of the contract in the first place. I kind of agree with you. Like, look, Andrew Brandt ran an NFL team salary cap for years, so who the hell am I to argue? But it does feel like, in addition to whatever you can do from a salary cap manipulation standpoint and the actual accounting, you can take less cash. Like it's simple. Now, his argument, I think his sort of better point is generally if a player leaves money on the table, all you're doing is helping the owner. But that doesn't mean it has to go that way. And I think there's definitely, it does provide the team with more flexibility and more capacity to go and give that money to specific players and maintain, a better roster around that guy. Now, it doesn't mean they will, and that might be the biggest stumbling block in this whole dynamic if you're advocating for that as, an approach from a quarterback, right? Whether or not you're the quarterback doing it, whether you're the fans making that case, hey, take less, help us out, win a championship. The single biggest stumbling block might be, what is stopping the owner from just pocketing that saving and not reinvesting the money into the rest of the team. Connecting the two, I think, is an important step there of, hey, I want to win championships. I'm willing to sacrifice some money along the way to make that happen, but you have to work with me here. We have to make sure that money does get back reinvested into the guys that I need it reinvested into to maintain this roster and to have a championship caliber team. And that, I think, is probably quite a difficult thing to guarantee.
That is the key, right? There is no reason to give these owners benefits and to help them out. They all can afford the most expensive roster in the NFL and then some. You have to also have the assurance that they are going to take that extra money, that excess, and spend it elsewhere. I mean, the example everyone always is going to go to is, of course, Tom Brady in New England. I kind of think it's a bit overblown. He did take, slightly below market deals at various times throughout his career, but I don't think it's as drastic as some people kind of paint it out to be. Nevertheless, when he did do that, let's say it took $5 million less per year here or there, they were then turning around and spending that money on other players, building out depth or adding a player at a position that was a bit of a weakness. So he wasn't just doing it out of the kindness of his heart to Robert Kraft. I know they're close, but also saying, if I'm going to do this, you need to then allocate it elsewhere. And tying back to our conversation, I mean, look, I think T. Higgins is in a very tough spot where, again, they can't afford to do it, but do they want to put about $100 million in three players on offense in Joe Burrow, right, T. Higgins, and Jamar Chase, which is what it's going to be, if not more than that? If Burrow says, look, I'll take less, then T. Higgins better get extended this offseason and not go into a contract year, maybe a franchise tag. That needs to happen, frankly, before Burrow signs, in my opinion, to have the guarantee, the assurance that they are going to use your savings elsewhere.
And the chances are, if you're taking less cash, if you're taking less money in the deal, you are probably also increasing the cap flexibility just as a matter of course, right? The numbers overall are lower. Obviously, the two are not necessarily linked one for one. The accountancy can be, or the salary cap accountancy can be moved around. It can be manipulated in a whole variety of different ways. I mean, just look at the various different quarterback monster deals and the way they're structured differently, right? There's a whole world of different ways of doing this. But if you're coming in with the ballpark, rule of thumb of, hey, I'm going to take 10% less than I could get, not only am I going to take less cash, but we can also, that will help the cap along the way.
So yes, and in every deal, yes, but it's going to vary the amount, the degree by each club, and that's where Cincinnati gets interesting. So Cincinnati does not, and they've had exceptions for quarterbacks, but in a general precedent, they do not guarantee any money outside the first year, outside the signing bonus of their contracts. And so what that requires then is players often get these large roster bonuses in the second year of their deal. Roster bonuses all hit the cap in that year as opposed to a prorated bonus because the players need protection and need more upfront cash to say, well, look, I have no guarantees, no assurances beyond the first year, maybe the second year, just because of the size of the bonus. Therefore, I need to get more cash earlier on. If Joe Burrow is going to say, okay, we're going to try to help you from a cash and in part a cap standpoint, they need to break precedent and be guaranteeing money in the third and fourth and so on year of this contract, whether that's a rolling guarantee, which is where it's not guaranteed at signing, but becomes guaranteed at a later date, or whatever the mechanism may be. That's where Cincinnati would also have to give and kind of work within their own parameters as well.
From a cash standpoint, I mean, you hear all the time about there being a couple of owners in the NFL that are very sort of cash poor relative to certainly some other owners, but relative to the league generally. Are the Bengals an ownership that need some help if they want, like, let's say in an ideal world, they want to sign Burrow, T. Higgins, and Jamar Chase all to long-term big money contracts and keep that group intact for as long as they can humanly do it? Given the money they've already given to, Orlando Brown and Trey Hendrickson and whoever, is this an ownership group that actually does need some concessions in terms of cash flow in this Joe Burrow contract to even feasibly make that happen? Because, the money that needs to get thrown in escrows and all those kinds of things.
Again, right. I'm not here to make excuses for owners or to push out their talking points that they use, and frankly, often are probably a bit facetious. But yeah, I mean, I think the Bengals are bottom 5 in liquidity among owners. I think it's probably a comfortable range for them to be. So, and look, even Hendrickson. If I'm Hendrickson, I'm looking for new money this offseason.
Sure.
He's already outplayed his deal, and he's going into the third year of a 4-year contract. So, I mean, I won't use the word need, but will they, if they don't get help, then say, okay, well, Hendrickson's going to play out his deal and then he's gone. We're going to cut Joe Mixon, which maybe we think they should do anyway. But they're going to start, saying, oh, well, it's tough, but we then can't keep this guy. Chidobe Awuzie going to the last year of his deal, he's gone. Mike Hilton going to the last year of his, they're going to start then saying, well, here are the ramifications of taking care of you three, which again, might be a lie, might be unrealistic or unfair of them to do. Yeah. But, the owners are obviously not here to give out handouts, willy-nilly. That is very evident.
You're right. Need is a good distinction because there's a difference between I don't have that cash right now to make that happen and I am unable to generate that form of liquidity because, again, as a man with an intimate, familiar working of the brain of a billionaire, right? The way this whole works is you have billion-dollar companies where you have no real cash, you just borrow against it. You get a giant sum of money at a really cheap rate because you own billions of dollars worth of equity and whatever, right? Every one of these owners owns a franchise that is worth billions of dollars. And if they want several $100 million in liquid cash, it's pretty easy to achieve that in today's markets. They would be able to drum that up without any problem by borrowing against a portion of the franchise that they're sitting there with. That doesn't feel like it would be an issue at all.
Interesting thing there. So to a degree, yes, but actually part of the many, many, many lawsuits and issues with Dan Snyder is there is a limit. You're only allowed to kind of leverage your franchise to a certain degree with loans. Yes, you can do it. They obviously should let owners do it to a degree, especially these kind of, family founded or organizations like the Cincinnati Bengals. But there is a cap on how much you can do it. Yeah, they probably could do it here, especially as it relates to escrows you mentioned earlier.
Right.
Have to put some cash aside for future fully guaranteed money. But again, the way they've avoided that is just never giving future fully guaranteed money. So it all will be interesting. I think both parties here need to be very creative, and I think they will be.
So a lot of times people seem to treat this as like a moral imperative, right? Of players should never leave any money on the table. You should never, create a team-friendly structure so that you can try and win a championship or whatever. It feels to me that once you're in the realm of generational, hundreds of millions of 8-figure contracts, then what difference does it make? Patrick Mahomes is unquestionably leaving a large sum of money on the table on a rolling basis throughout this contract. On the other hand, he's making a large sum of money. He's got it practically guaranteed through the duration of this thing, and it does help the team maintain a championship caliber roster around him. So what's the downside?
I would just look, I totally get the argument. You hear it all the time. I have this conversation with family members and stuff. I do get that as fan of sports, we also come back from a foundation of we want to relate to these guys. We want to see ourselves in them and all those things. It is very easy for the American populace to make that argument with millionaires. Why don't we make it with billionaires? Okay, right. You could also say, why does Paul Brown need to make this amount of money? He could make a little bit less this year, still have an asset worth $5 billion that he can sell at any point or do whatever he wants with. So I get it. I hear you. I just think it's much easier for us to do that. They're still making generational wealth. Patrick Mahomes' great grandkids are going to be wealthy individuals, but But Paul Brown's entire family lineage for the rest of eternity, if he holds on to the Bengals, will be billionaires.